Welcome everyone. This is our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar on building a career in trade policy. As people are coming into the room, I'm going to say a few words about the Trade Policy Research Forum before we hand over to our host and panelists. So TPRF was something that I'm Ben Shepherd, started with my colleague Hannah Norberg, who's also on screen, nearly 2 years ago now. And our objective was to try and bring something like a brown bag seminar to as many people around the world as possible, in particular in environments where they may not usually have access to it. So you'll see that our logo looks kind of like a bridge. And one thing that we're trying to do is to build different bridges. We're building bridges with different parts of the trade policy community. So Hannah and I are both economists, but we love having lawyers and political scientists on the webinar. So to try and build these bridges with all different parts of the trade policy community, practitioners, as well as a group of people that we really love having involved. Another type of bridge that we try to build is between people at different levels of experience. So people who've been doing this for some time, they're experienced, they've found their way into the trade policy world, and those, of course, who are just getting started. So whether it's undergraduate students, graduate students, people in their first job, but those who might need to know a little more about how the trade policy world and trade policy organisations work. So those are the sorts of bridges that we're keen to build. Of course, we also want to try and reach people outside Europe and North America, which is where a lot of the action in trade policy on a global scale takes place. So we're very keen to reach out to people all around the world and get them involved in the seminar. Our host, Geoffrey, who I'll introduce in a moment, is going to tell you more about how to interact with our speakers during the session. But we do try to make these sessions as interactive as possible, particularly when it's something like careers, where if you're sitting there and you have a question, it's almost certain that someone else has the same question. So you can feel free to put it in Zoom's Q&A feature, or alternatively, you can put it in the chat. So the session is going to be recorded. Let me remind everyone that we have people here who have generously given their time to be on the panel. They are, of course, speaking in a personal capacity. None of it is binding on their organisations in any way. The session will be recorded. It'll be posted on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it, rewatch it potentially if there's something that you missed. And of course, we will give you details as to how to stay in touch with us and with our seminars, which take place about once a month at the end of the session. So with that, let me introduce the session. As I said, it's building a career in trade policy. It's our second career session that we've done. The first one was very successful. We had a lot of people attend and a lot of positive feedback. And we're very lucky on this occasion to have it hosted by Geoffrey Chapman, who's a volunteer here at the Trade Policy Research Forum. So he helps us out in all sorts of different ways, and he's going to be chairing the session today. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Jeff, to introduce our panelists and get the session started.
Thanks. Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everybody. So as Ben outlined very briefly, a quick introduction to myself. So I am an economic advisor in the UK, currently working in different areas and about to move departments, so I won't go into detail on that. But very privileged and honoured indeed to have the three panellists with us today. So we've got Vicky Chemutai, Michael Ferrantino, and Greg Messenger. So each, I think, coming from very different perspectives, which is why I assembled these three. And hopefully it will become clearer at least why Greg is in this picture, because obviously he doesn't work for the World Bank. But I'm going to ask him about that in a minute or two. So to kick things off, I think my burning question at least, and hopefully one that most of you are interested in, is the route into the World Bank. So Vicky, if I could turn to you please first, could you please give us a quick outline of how you got into the bank, as well as any specific requirements that you had to meet in order to get the role?
Can I just jump in there for just one quick second before you guys rip off? So welcome everybody, I'm Hannah Norberg, and I'm just here to tell you that we really want you involved in these questions. So go ahead and hop on the chat, hop on the Q&A sessions, and just fill them out as we go, so that people can answer your questions as we go along. Welcome. Sorry, Geoffrey. Go ahead, Vicky.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. And really thank you to Ben and Hannah for organizing this TPRF. I think it's vitally useful to this community, at least the trade policy community. So it's really a pleasure to be on this forum. So Jeff, to your question, how did I get into the World Bank, right? And what requirements did I have to meet? So I got in first as a consultant, and several of you will know, and maybe as the discussion eventually unfolds, I'll probably detail a little bit more about the different tracks that people take to enter some of these international organizations, such as a bank. Now, I entered as a consultant, and how that came about is because I was working at the WTO at the time in Geneva on WTO accession issues, a little bit of trade policy here, and I bumped into Annabelle Gonzalez, who was a director at that time at the World Bank of the Trade Department at the Geneva sort of public forum. It's called a public forum, and I think it's actually ongoing this September as well. So during that public forum sort of hallway discussion, I mentioned interest in working on some trade issues at the bank. She seemed also keen and sort of interested to hear my story and the type of work that I had been doing. And from that discussion, we ended up sort of talking about a consultancy. And that is really how it happened. So when you hear people telling you about networking and reaching out to people, yes, it works. It really does work. Those conversations, in the hallways actually do work. So obviously that needs to be backed up by some, good technical standing. Naturally, you can't just walk up to somebody and maybe not have something substantive to share. But that really was the catalyst to my journey into the bank. So after that initial discussion, I did a couple of interviews with some colleagues who were at the bank at that time. And then I eventually came to DC so a couple of months later. So as a consultant, you joined the trade unit. And at that time, Michael Ferrantino, who's with us today, was also a lead economist in that same unit. And you work with different teams. I worked with him on a couple of issues. I worked with a couple of other teams. And with that sort of diversification of teamwork did help in my growth in the work that I did at the bank. I worked on trade policy issues and trade facilitation. I worked on some operational projects. I did some analysis here. I did some advisory analytics, some technical assistance activities. So a little bit of the whole sphere of what goes on in the trade world. And because of that, I was able to build my portfolio. And then eventually I got an extended term consultancy at the bank, which is basically a 2-year program. That basically means you're staff, but you're not really staff. It's like a second step towards a staff level position. And thankfully, after that, I applied for this young professionals program and got in, and now that's a full staff position. So as you can see, it's sort of been a gradual sequential progression over time. And in each of those years, I really had to work hard, pull up your socks and really maintain those talks and networks and speaking to different people, working with them and trying to, prove myself worthy. I think everybody has to do that at some point in their lives. It eventually paid off. So that is the short of the journey into the World Bank. In terms of the requirements, I think, and looking around our trade sort of unit, even beyond the trade unit, generally within the bank, a minimum of a master's degree is necessary. Unfortunately, I don't think anything below that could work unless you come in for an internship position. In terms of whether experience counts vis-a-vis education, I would say that for a PhD. So, for example, I do not currently have a PhD. So the years of experience I had garnered over time did help to substitute for the PhD that I did not have. But a master's is really the minimum requirement. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. And of course, if there are more questions, follow-up questions during the Q&A session, hopefully the audience will put them in the chat. Michael, if I can go to you next then, since you spent so many years in the bank as a lead economist, of course, what changes maybe have you seen over time? You know, is Vicky's example a typical route in, or, you know, how's it changed?
Well, there are a lot of different stories. I mean, I certainly think that networking helps. And I mean, you know, my story as well is a bit idiosyncratic. I was an academic solely an academic for a while. Then I was in a national government for 19 years doing trade policy at the United States International Trade Commission. And that is a route that some people take. And I encourage people always in the first place that the World Bank is not the only trade policy job in the world. Okay. I mean, it is this big, shiny thing. My colleague at IFPRI, Will Martin, is fond of saying that the World Bank isn't as good as it looks from the outside, but it's not as bad as it looks from the inside. And when people get in, that, you know, they kvetch about the bureaucracy and all of this. But what can you do? Because I imagine that a lot of the folks on our call today, you know, are not going to be in Geneva where they're just going to run into Annabelle Gonzalez, okay? So how can you, so what can you do? And I can, what I think I'd like to do is to share the experience of some of my younger colleagues who reached out to me with me not having, you know, much idea of who they were, and are now making careers at the bank. And this is going to be a sort of a composite picture. So let's say that somebody is in grad school, or they're in another organization. Maybe they're in a consultancy that specializes in trade facilitation, and which, you know, sells its services to the World Bank or the IDB or USAID or whoever. And let's say you just find somebody that you think you'd like to work with, because you want to study the organization, the kind of organizations that you want to work in. You know, follow their publications, follow, you know, what seminars they're announcing. And so, you know, I would get just like cold emails from young people at that stage in their career. And if I projected into a pre-COVID situation, it would be, I'm in the Washington area, and can I do an informational interview? Could I have like 20 minutes of your time? And if so, could you let me in the building and I will buy you coffee? Okay, and of course I can afford coffee, but you know, the gesture is appreciated. And of course, in some ways it's easier to do this in the Zoom era, because you know, anybody can sort of meet in this virtual office. And the thing about saying that you want to do an informational interview is that you're not applying for a position. There may not even be a position open. You're simply asking, what is it like to work in your organization? Tell me about what you do. You know, you can tell them a little bit about yourself. You can send a CV, but basically you're trying to collect information. And most people, if they're willing to talk with you without that pressure on, are happy to tell you all about what they do, you know, because their spouse and children got bored hearing about their job years ago, right? So they'll talk to you. And you know, then if you ask interesting questions and are engaging. I mean, there were so there would be times when I would just volunteer after one conversation with somebody to circulate their CV among colleagues. And sometimes that's what it took, because somebody else would need a consultant with that set of skills, and they would be desperate because they'd be at that stage in the project year where like all the good consultants are already booked up. You know, and then in some cases it doesn't make sense. Like if you use 20 minutes of my time and your specialty is communication strategies for education, which is something I know nothing about, you know, then I'll be honest and say, look, you know, I'm not really a useful part of your network. But don't be afraid to have a dialogue with somebody when there's no immediate prospect of a job. I know one person who's done a lot of consultancy for the bank that we were in a dialogue for 2 years before there was an opportunity. And these things may seem like a waste of time, but they're not.
Bob wants to chip in as well. Thanks, Michael. I think I'm going to return to the networking point since both Vicky and Jeff now mentioned that. But let's go to Greg quickly. So obviously consultancy has now been mentioned. So Greg, how do you fit into this picture?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, so it's an interesting, slightly strange one. So I come in as an academic, right? So then you kind of think, well, if you're interested in working in, for example, the World Bank or the WTO or the IMF, why would you become an academic, which is a career path, to then do something which isn't that career path, right? Like doesn't feel, I mean, I'm not an economist by training, it doesn't feel efficient, right? In terms of like the way that you do these things. And I suppose there's multiple different ways. And I think depending on the type of work you want to do, working in these areas from an academic position can actually be really valuable and really interesting and really engaging. So with the caveat that there are barriers to entry, and there's lots of different ways to try and restrict those, but they are still, like Vicky says, PhDs in academia is kind of that you need the PhD to get in. If you can't get funding for a PhD, speaking super frankly with my cards on the table, I wouldn't do one. I think it is to ask an awful lot of someone and to encourage and for them to take on a lot of personal debt. Do something else and then find ways to pay for it that way or through funding, but it's a challenge. And then there are real structural problems around that. However, once you're doing it, so where do you kind of fit in as an academic? Like, what do you actually contribute to the sort of work that others do? Well, there's one thing from within academia and then another thing which is engaging. So from within academia, the sort of research that you do, and whether you're a lawyer, an economist, a political scientist, there's rigorous, high quality, evidence-based research is valuable, right? That is just valuable and important, right? You can also, if you're interested, to use the utterly ghastly civil servicey term, thought leadership, but it can, because you're an independent person focusing on an area of personal interest, that can work quite well, right? So if you want to put forward something, you can do that and you can pursue those goals. And I think those are all quite good. I think if you're interested in, and then so like, why would you then engage more directly? Well, I think it's because you want to speak to people and work with people and shape agendas where you see the activity happening. So you don't want to stand aside. There's perfectly legitimate reasons why people don't want to involve themselves and engage, right? That's totally fair choice. You can choose to. So if I think of like my own sort of path, which was very traditional, I trained pretty much as an international lawyer in public international law, then I specialized in international economic law and trade. And in those days, pre-2016 in the UK, I had to say, I'm an international lawyer that works on trade. And then they go, oh, and what else? And you go, oh, well, I'm not bad on environment as well, and MEAs and stuff. And they go, oh, well, okay, fine. Can you teach constitutional law though? That's kind of where we were. Obviously, Brexit happens. So for the UK, suddenly there's a large demand for people who did WTO and trade law generally before that. Before that, I had already been working with governments in different ways, largely working as a consultant in relation to litigation, in international law issues, and had done some public engagement stuff as well. Over time, I started then working with, I was lucky I was brought in projects working with the World Health Organization and some of the regional offices, and that's kind of capacity building and training for officials. And then subsequently then, after Brexit from 2018 to 2022, I worked in the UK government as a seconded official, which was a very, very exciting, interesting time for me personally, because it meant that I could see the inner workings. And I think Michael's comments was quite interesting as well about this idea of, you know, it's not always necessarily the international organization. You can get really important experience at home as well. And there is no question about, you deal with people in lots of different countries that work in their ministries, and you know that they're fantastic. And it's not like that there's, oh, but they didn't work in X country or something like that. You know, it really is quality people are quality people, full stop, right? And you see that. And the other thing about that as well, I'd just say is, obviously, I didn't design the referendum, but professionally it worked quite well. It's a bit like Vicky's conversation in the corridor, right? And Michael talking about networking and opportunity. It's about grabbing stuff. And it's about being flexible and being willing to say, I had research plans, and as an academic, you plan out your research projects a couple of years advanced. The opportunity came up to work in government, and I took that. And that changed my plans, and that's fine. And I'm happy to have done that. But it means you have to be a bit flexible about that sort of stuff. But it is quite interesting. And now I work in various different ways from the outside again, with governments advising in different capacities. So you can sort of do that as an academic route. And I think it's quite nice because depending on your institution, they can be more or less supportive, depending on the academic culture in your country. Some places it works very well because you can be incentivized to do that sort of work. Some places less so, they might just not care but leave you do it. That's fine. And you kind of need to scope out your academic structures a bit. So it gives you quite a lot of flexibility. And as an academic, you choose what you work on, right? So you're doing that. That's really nice. You get to set your own priorities. The only other thing as well, I'd say, which we kind of, because at the moment we're very much thinking in terms of consulting and supporting and doing that sort of work. The other thing that we do in academia in terms of trade policy, which is really nice, and I think is something that sometimes we kind of forget a little bit about, is you get to teach and train like generations of new scholars and people working in trade policy. And one of the things I quite enjoy is in law schools where I'm based, about half of our graduates traditionally don't practice law, right? They go into different areas. And in trade in particular, I think it's really valuable to be able to say, you can go and work in international organizations. You can go and work in your governments, but there's also industry sectoral representative bodies that require people who know this stuff and who want, you know, so there's lots of opportunities, which is quite nice. And a lot of those opportunities I'm able to flag to students and tell them about exactly because I've been working with people who are policy professionals in those different areas. So it's quite a nice mix, and it lets you control a bit, I think, what you want to do or not do. I'll leave that.
Thanks, Rick. I think strange now as well, my experience as well, it's a bit of good fortune in time and space, in a sense that my career path into trade as well started essentially from a hallway corridor conversation with a lecturer. But that was right at the beginning, and ever since I've also had to grind away and work at it. But let's come to the networking now. Obviously, COVID has been a really big thing. There's still, of course, a bit of a concern, and it's maybe evolved, I guess, the way that we network. Certainly, of course, we're having this conversation over Zoom. And a personal perspective on this as well is that many of the analysts, or economists at least, that I engage with are quite introverted. And so oftentimes networking is maybe more of a challenge than in other professions. So Vicky or Michael, I don't know, do you want to comment on that? How do you think we can go about networking in this day and age?
Okay, maybe I could start. And maybe just a little bit to go back to my story, because joining the bank was not my entry into trade. I was already in trade at the WTO. So my entry into trade was actually through an internship program called the China's Accessions Internship Program at the WTO, funded by the government of China. And how I got that one was really blind application. You know, you just sit down on your computer and write a hopefully moving motivational essay, and then just send it and you know, fill in the requirements and all of that. So the initial, what I want to sort of highlight is the initial, sometimes the initial will just have to be a blind, because people don't know you, they don't know your story, they don't know what you can offer, because at that time joining the bank, there was a little bit of what I could offer that was a little bit more, say, known than at that time when I applied for the internship. It was just blind, and I, you know, thankfully got it. But that was the real entry and the beginning. And that's just it's to encourage people that you do not necessarily, I mean, you don't need to know people, especially if you're really at that very beginning point of your career. You may not know them, and that's okay, but that should not dissuade you in any way to not apply for these opportunities that you may see, even a consultancy. As Michael mentioned, you know, when a CV is circulated around the network and the team of experts that we have, people look at those CVs. When you see, you know, it matches the requirements of what you're looking for in a particular in project, then that person will be taken on board. And I have seen that happen personally for about 10 people. We often see a CV circulated and we're like, oh, this person has this particular skills, let's bring them into this project or bring them into this research. So that networking of just reaching out to somebody and saying, you know what, hello, Ben Shepherd, I am very interested in your, you know, current research on RCAs, and this is something I'm also interested in. These are my personal thoughts. You know, here is my CV, and I'm interested in future opportunities. That goes a long way. So what I'm trying to say is that you do not necessarily have to meet in the hallway. You can do the email, sending out, and I have also personally received several CVs from different people that are all great, and I have them, you know, even if right now there's not a particular opportunity, I do actually have a bank of CVs of you know, people that I think are just great and that we shall have to use at some point. So I don't think you should be afraid. Just reach out. Sometimes you can ask for time, and you know, some people are just completely stretched and there's no time to dedicate to actually have that 30-minute conversation. You can ask for it, you can try indeed, but take it graciously if they're not able to give that to you. They will certainly do that whenever they can. I know personally, I am very interested in helping out because I also, you know, I went through my own journey, and I'm very thankful to all of those that allowed to speak to me. But then also right now I'm in that position and I'm unable to dedicate, you know, all the time to the several people that reach out. I do try to, you know, at least 2-3 a week, and eventually, you know, over time, I'll probably tick all the boxes, but be gracious with the with the replies that you may get over time. But yeah, the emails work. Send them and send your CVs.
Very interesting point. And touching then on your point, Michael, about the 2-year kind of conversation, I guess, that you had on and off with this one individual. I guess now with COVID and that Teams or Zoom is quite a big thing, that you could have those conversations digitally.
Yeah, it is, and it is about, you know, really about initiative. It is. I mean, of course, you have to have the skills, and if I can tell from somebody's background that they don't have the skills, then I may just you know, like I may just go silent, okay, you know, which is just evidence that I'm a very busy person who you actually did want to talk to. I'm kidding, but so last time we did one of these job sessions, I would say maybe 5 or 6 people asked to add me on LinkedIn afterwards. And I added all of them. One person sent me a personal email and said, can we have a discussion? And that person is actually doing consultancy with the bank now. That is not a guarantee, okay? But like, you get something by doing something, not by doing nothing.
That's good advice. Hannah and Ben, both have your hands up.
Yeah, I have first a quick question to Vicky. Are you what did you train as, an economist or a lawyer or?
Thanks.
That was
So,
my first question.
okay, sure. I'll answer it. And then the second question. Very well. So I actually have a bit of both in my background. So I did quantitative economics for my bachelor's, and then I did international trade policy and trade law for my master's. So it is a bit of both.
And you're not from Geneva, so it was a pretty.
No. Oh, I should have started with that. I'm Ugandan. So I actually worked with the ministry. I worked with the local government for a little bit before I landed, and I managed to land that Geneva internship. So I was making those applications in Kampala, Uganda. And to be honest, I didn't think I'd ever get it. Naturally, you don't know anybody. It's a whole brand new, the other side of the world. How would you really get it? Exactly. So it's really, I had no prior connection with the Geneva world at all. It was just really blindly applying.
Yeah, that takes a lot of courage. So, to be sitting there in Uganda yourself, and maybe you've not even been to Geneva, and then you get there, and then you manage to bump into Annabelle. But I would also just like to offer some advice here, and that is, because I also run the Trade Express, right? So I get to have these conversations pretty often about, how to do your career thing. And I think one thing that we could help ourselves with is thinking about these applications not as something that's super personal, reaching out to people like Michael, say, hey, I happen to be in DC, or could you jump on Zoom or whatever, right? Not take it personally. Just think that you have to do 20 of them, and that's part of your training, right? Just do it. Just sit down and do it. Forget that you did it. Don't make such a big deal out of it, and ask anyone for input. So just send in your CV and just ask someone, hey, Greg, I know you've seen thousands of this. Is there anything that's obvious to you? Greg might not answer. Then I'll reach out to him again in 2 months, and then again 2 months later. It really doesn't matter. Either he saw the email and he'll spend the time, or he didn't see it and didn't turn me personally down. So just do it. It doesn't really matter. Just put yourself out there, and whatever. Everybody trips up. Everybody's uncomfortable in networking. That's fine. Just do it anyway.
I want to applaud you for saying that. That is very, very important, because oftentimes our inability to actually get to the next level is because we're afraid, we're scared, and we let that fear cripple us. So yes, just do it. And you can do, because I've done like hundreds of applications. Oh my God. And received hundreds of rejections. So it takes, you build muscle. Actually, now I look at a rejection, if I ever applied, and I'm like, it's okay, no biggie. I reached that point. I think you need to reach that point where a rejection is not, or an ignoring is okay. Because out of those, something will eventually turn up.
Interesting.
Exactly. So I usually think about it like I have to do 100.
Right. And I think that I did something like 300 over 2 years before I got my first job as an assistant professor, which reminds me, as we're talking about how to be successful by being rejected for jobs, Hannah and Ben, one day we need to talk about how to be successful by being rejected by journals for publication, because that's another interesting experience.
I don't think I have a seminar long enough to list all my rejections. I actually wanted to move on to a slightly, it's something that's come up, and I just wanted to say two things. One is just to alert people who are watching that there is a Q&A box in Zoom, and so some of the presenters have been kind enough to answer things on the fly in there with written answers, so you can quickly go and change the tab and see how they've answered that. So just so that everyone's aware of that. But then the question that I wanted to ask, if I think of my own policy, my own sort of story in getting to trade policy, I started out in law. The first course I ever took that had anything to do with international trade was trade law and WTO law after public international and all this sort of thing. Then I did international relations. And then finally, after that, I made it to economics, which is what I actually do now. Now, I find that the skills from all of those different things are actually kind of useful in my job. They come together in different ways. And I've always thought that for lawyers working in this area, you know, you need a fair amount of economics. Economists ideally would have a bit of law and a bit of political science as well. And so my question is, and I think it's particularly for Greg and Michael, where do people go? If you're thinking of a graduate school program and you're thinking, I'd like to have a career in international trade, does it make sense to do something highly specialized, like say quantitative economics or public international law, or one of these other kinds of courses that many universities have now in international studies, international affairs, international relations, all those sorts of things? How do you see that kind of playing out? And Greg, maybe I can go to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I think that there's a few different challenges. I'm always a bit wary of reputation, right? Because usually reputation essentially just entrenches long-standing inequalities, and it's usually a generation out of date anyway. So you'll get this stuff. The other challenge as well is when you start getting to more specialized areas, it's really because there's one person there who's well known and does X, Y, and Z, and they may well have moved institutions. So in the UK, for example, we move around quite a lot. So you can have someone go, start a PhD program, and then actually the people you went there for have since gone. So there's a bit of a question there. There is scope to move with them. I think at a master's level, it's a bit more straightforward. You can go in. Coming from myself as a who went the sort of the international law and then trade angle, I think it's very useful to. There's a couple of different ones which I think actually are very impressive, and I like. One is, and Vicky, I know you did this sort of program, is when you have the mixes where they do law and economics, which isn't something that I did, and I think it's very, very impressive, and I think it's very interesting. You see it, people coming out like Bocconi as well, like sort of people coming out with very interesting degrees and perspectives, and I think that's quite welcome. The master's program, it sounds awful to say, so is not going to specialize you in anything. No master's program specializes you. They're all general. Because, and even your PhD doesn't really, like your PhD specializes you to a certain point in a certain area, it basically teaches you to write. So then you get to these sorts of points to do these different things. So actually having different angles, I think, is quite useful. And being in a place where you think you're going to be able to get introductions and network as well, I think is really, really valuable. The only other thing that I definitely would say is wherever you are, go somewhere else if you can. Yeah. Doesn't matter. I had students when I was teaching in Oxford, I had students who wanted to stay for the masters, and I was like, no, don't stay here, don't do it. And that's where I did my masters, but I'm like, it's great, but like, don't do it. You did your undergrad here, it's crazy. Go somewhere else. Meet new people, do different things, be in a different place. That's really, really valuable. Open up your networks as well. But yeah, Michael, welcome your views on that.
Yeah, no, those are really great points, and I like the last one very much about going to different places and opening up the network that way. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Michael, you know, when you're sitting or when you were sitting in a recruiter's position at the bank, and you would see these different sorts of CVs come in, you know, the kind of hardcore economist who's done their bachelor's, their master's, their PhD all the way through in economics, or when you see people who've got a mix of different skills, how does that affect how you look at the application?
I think that, you know, one has to look, you know, not only at how a person is on paper, but on what they're engaged in. Because if I have a chance to talk with somebody, then I'm interested in curiosity. I'm interested in, you know, what do you know that you didn't learn in school? Okay, are you like, for example, you don't have to have ever taken a course that talked about the WTO to follow what happened at the WTO. You know, in Brexit, nobody had a course on Brexit. You know, nobody had a course on NAFTA. You know, you just, you know, like, and yeah, it's very good that there are these programs that bridge law and economics. But if you can do one thing competently, and people will take you on board for that, then you'll have an opportunity to do other things. Like I've like my academic background was in economics, and my grad fields were in international economics and industrial organization. I am an amateur trade lawyer. I really knew very little about trade law until I joined the USITC, and somebody said, you ought to start reading John Jackson. And now some years later, people like, oh, you know, Michael, how is it that you know the trade law back and forward? Are you a trade, you know? And I'm like, no, I just hung around people who were, who were engaged with these things and was curious. So if your academic bent is one way or another, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing what you're good at and being curious about the rest.
Yeah, can I just one last thing? I mean, something that Michael said, which is I think really important as well, is the sort of, you know, and then seeing what other things people do, and it's kind of like what are the skills for the role, right? And that's particularly, and it's one of the reasons why, and it touches a bit on Geoffrey's comment earlier. You can, if you want to work with policy professionals, and particularly if you're wanting at a national level, especially, and an international, I'm less familiar, so but at a national level, if you want to be able to speak to diplomats and officials, your very, very detailed, deep expertise isn't the only thing that matters. It's the way that you communicate it, and are you able to communicate it? And that's actually a very rare skill set. And I think all of the stuff that Hannah and Vicky have been talking about is kind of like builds your ability to do those things. That sort of outward facing stuff, that's saying like, I'm willing to go and engage with people, I'm willing to give it a shot. And as Michael said, I got some very good advice when I was applying for jobs, which was you only need one yes. That's all you need. You just need one yes. So, you know, there's a folder on your computer somewhere with all the places you applied for jobs that you forget you even applied for, but doesn't matter. But it's being able to talk to people and communicate, I think, is really, really valuable. And unfortunately, we're not great at teaching that.
I think there was also something you once mentioned in the previous careers webinar, Michael, where at the end of the conversation with somebody, the last question you ask is, who do I talk to next? And I think that's something that really stuck in my mind as a great way to keep that network going and to expand it.
Yeah, that's right. If you can end by asking, you know, sort of, can you introduce me to one more person? That's a great strategy. And I want to you know, also agree with what Greg said, that when you're doing your early jobs, wherever you happen to land first, it is really important that you develop communication skills, because I know people who are first water international trade economists who, when they are in front of an audience of non-specialist policymakers, don't adjust their communication style, seem to almost deliberately misunderstand the questions they get, you know, not realizing that they're in a graduate school, but that you really ought to be in the mode of, how would I explain Brexit to my Aunt Minnie?
Yeah.
You know, and you can do this, and you should, even if you're only doing school, emphasize this. I mean, and Vicky can tell you, because she did work with me for a while, and like a chunk of my advice would be things like looking at PowerPoints and saying, you need to increase the fonts on these and make your lines thicker. Okay. And like, it shouldn't take an Ivy League PhD to do that, but there are many Ivy League PhDs who are unaware that they ought to, right? And so, you know, build that, you know, like if you if your goal is to, brief the Director General of the WTO, like the way to, like really you should, everything you do, you should try to direct at your Aunt Minnie while still being technically sound.
I always quite like the why does it matter, not the why is it interesting. Whereas for us, it's often, why is it interesting? That's why I want to research it. But it's actually for, for officials, diplomats, directors, ministers, it's like, well, why does this matter? Like, tell me quickly, come on. It's not a murder mystery novel. I don't want a twist at the end now.
Yep, Hannah?
I think Vicky was before me.
But it really just was to sort of echo all the sentiments really on the importance of communication. We see that a lot, I think, for all international development organizations. Who is the audience for all our work or all our outputs? What are we trying to sort of get across? And as Michael mentioned, I mean, you'll realize very quickly that people couldn't care less about your regression or results or the confidence or whatever it is. Nobody cares. They really just want to understand what it is. And if you're speaking to, officials from the government, that is actually, I was in a panel interview a couple of weeks ago, and we were interviewing for some trade senior trade post, and the one of the main sort of threads that came out in each of them was whether they had the ability to communicate with the policymaker audience, and how that comes out in the interview is really how you talk about the work that you do and maybe the projects that you've worked on and maybe the results, and basically how you conceptualize some of those very technical issues and how you project them to your audience. So that is, I just want to say that is a basis within which that most people will have to be tested on in order to get a successful job and career in most development organizations. Actually, it is really how you're able to engage and speak to the policymaker. So just to echo what Michael said.
Now, Geoffrey, before you let me in, you are moderating here, and Ben and I are just like, we jump right back into our own, regular places. And so in case you want to move forward with the program, feel free to do so and just ignore me.
No, you carry on, Hannah.
All right. Okay. Then in that case, so I'm trained as an economist in Sweden. And Sweden, Nobel Prize, everything here is all about game theory. So talking about policy was an absolute faux pas. You were not a serious economist if you were interested in policy. So it took me a long time to get to that. And so I think that that's something to be really important to figure out exactly what it is that you do want to do. And then there's a question regarding, how do you prepare for these interviews in the Q&As? And I think the most important thing is that you do prepare, right? And prepare for it. So at the Trade Experts, we actually have a program for our members. So you can jump on that if you want to do it that way with us, or you can just gather your friends, right? It really doesn't matter. Do the prep interview with your friends, people who support you, because we criticize ourselves all the time. So we'd rather just have that Aunt Vicky, or what did you call her? And Michael, someone who just loves you, right? And just tells you how awesome you are, because you will question yourself over and over again, right? But so make sure that you have gotten that out of your system, all the nervousness, all the questioning yourself, the sweatiness. It's all right. Everybody does it. And do prepare for like an elevator pitch. So that once you do get sweaty, once you do sort of lose your track, train of thought, whatever, so you have something to get back to, and just practice. We're just talking about that. My most useful prep was a course I took in Montessori for preschool teachers and working at a gym as a trainer. Those two just as important in my career as all the economist trainings.
Very unexpected, Hannah. Ben?
Yeah.
I mean, just hearing, so, firstly, to give a bit of a plug for what we're doing here at the forum, I think some of the skills issues that have come up, we're really conscious of. I know for me, one of the hardest things to figure out after coming out of my PhD was how to talk to normal people and how to write for normal people. And so these are two big skills, and we're currently looking at ways that we can either run a session, maybe do a short booklet on sort of, how to actually pick this up, because it's not something that really any graduate school program, I think, teaches particularly well, because they're of course academic programs, so they want to ensure that you're successful academically. So that's one thing, just a plug for what we're doing. Then the second thing, I guess maybe it's a question for Michael. This is one that came in over email, so apparently there may be an issue with the chat box. But it's someone who's saying, look, I'm a political scientist, I don't have a PhD, I'm in an organisation, and I have the impression that it's difficult for me to move into certain roles or beyond a certain point, either because people are looking for an economist or because people are looking for a PhD. So the question that I'd like to ask, kind of based on the comment, is, do we see increasingly in the organisations that a PhD is necessary to get into certain levels of the organisation? And, is it really necessary, or is it just a market effect that this is supply and demand? We know we can ask for it, therefore we kind of do. So that's kind of question one. Then question two is, if you are a little bit into your career and you're sort of feeling that there's this kind of informal ceiling, what can you do to try and get around that? What are the options that you have? So maybe, Michael, if I throw to you for that one.
Right. Okay. So one thing that I've seen people do is to get into an organization and find that they have certain roles, but then they notice that the higher rank and better paying positions seem to be filled by PhDs. You can get into them as a master's, do a lot of quantitative work, and then decide to stop out from your work in the organization to do your PhD. Then, once you kind of know that you're on a career path, and in fact, from the point of view of being a graduate advisor, I would rather have a mature student who knows why they're there than a 22-year-old right from college who all they know is school. Okay. So there is that. I mean, and yeah, the other thing is that there are all kinds of roles for people who don't have PhDs. I wonder if we were to survey the people that hold the very top jobs at the World Bank, how many of them don't have either a PhD or a law degree, but they became, if Vicky's going to put her hand up here, because there, as I see no ceiling on her career in international organizations, and she has not yet felt that the necessity to take out time to do the PhD. So let me just give it to her.
Oh, I would beg to differ. I do see the necessity to indeed take time out at some point to do the PhD. Based on just, let's say, analysis, right? Anecdotal evidence looking at, those that actually make it to the top, all of them have PhDs. Maybe there's a very few group, let's say 5%, that does not. And I think that's just because of the way the institution had been designed and how it recruited at that time, because those that are at senior roles now have been there probably for 20, 25 years plus. So it is that's just the lay of the land. Now, at this point in time, I also recognize that it would be useful to do a PhD. And I think at some point it's definitely in my near-term objectives. However, there's so much excitement in the type of work that I'm currently doing that I still want to stay in for just a little longer. I don't know whether that will change in the near future. I hope it does, but I am doing so much exciting stuff, and I feel like not having a PhD has not been an impediment in any way thus far. So Michael, you're right in that analysis, but forward looking, I think I might want to do it, not necessarily because I want to fulfill that box and tick it, but simply because it might be nice to just get back into the space of doing like proper in-depth research and trying to analyze a particular problem. So more out of curiosity about a particular topic that I am, and I have several in my mind that I have come across in the past 3 years. So it's more out of curiosity, not necessarily because I need to tick the box. However, I do think there's a correlation between growth and a PhD. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, not only that, but you have to deal with annoying people like Ben, who will, put up a slide to introduce the session, and it will say, Dr. Vicky, which kind of reminds me of the Big Bang Theory. And, I'm sure sooner or later you want to have someone come up and say, Dr. Chemutai.
Well, yes, I mean, that would certainly be nice. I want to touch upon a question that I've seen in the chat, and that is on preparation for the interviews. Hannah touched upon it just a little bit, but I get this question a lot, and I think the one thing that always works is doing mock interviews. Reach out to several people, anybody who has time, from Aunt Min to, the practice manager or lead or some top expert in any organization, or even your grandpa. Just speak to these people, because in doing so, you're able to, talk to them and maybe try to humanize whatever you're saying and not come out as a robot. Because when you enter that interview room, you want to be able to fluidly have a conversation. Because in the interview room, beyond testing your your experience and all of that, they're also testing whether it would be nice to work with a person like you, whether you have that nice, agreeable personality that I would actually want to work with you over the next 4 years and not feel frustrated. So that personable aspect is also something that is in a way tested, even though it is not written down, but people subconsciously get a sense of it when they have the interview with you. So do tons of those mock interviews. They cannot be substituted for anything else in the preparation stage.
Greg, I'm going to come to you in a second. I am mindful that we're running out of time, but I've got a question for you as well, so maybe preempting your hand there. How common are part-time PhDs, and do you think that's a feasible route forward for people?
So on that, yes, they do happen, definitely. And for people who are working, they work quite well. The only thing that I'd caution a little bit with a part-time PhD is completion rates for PhDs can be tricky anyway, and completion rates for part-time PhDs tend to be lower because, for very good reasons, it's really hard to do it when you're doing other things. And it's easy to lose momentum because, by the time you get to the end of the PhD, you hate it. You cannot bear the thought of you looking at the thing. It's just, you're like, ugh, I'm sick to death. So part-time can work very, very well. It depends a bit on the person and it depends on their role. But I think, yeah, absolutely. And like for myself, I'd always be very happy to supervise a part-time PhD depending on what the person's doing. And I think it's certainly a scope. I was just going to say, I mean, like Vicky's point, exactly on the interviews as well, exactly this idea about, it's basically a bit like a date, right? You need to like each other in the end. And so there's a quest element around that. But I think for the key thing is, as Hans already said as well, preparation. I've been in plenty of interviews where you have someone that's super nervous, and you say, and preparation helps take the edge off that, and people will still be nervous, and that's okay, because you don't want people to feel uncomfortable and freaked out. That's not good for anyone. But if they're not prepared, they're not serious, that's just insulting. right? And I think it's really important to be clear about that, is if you're nervous, don't worry, try to keep it under people will take care of it. If you don't know about the institution, if you don't know about the role, if you don't know about what you're going to be doing, you're wasting everyone's time. And there are people who could be much better suited to sit in that chair. So it's properly like going over, and with a stopwatch if you've got to do a presentation, because it is just get used to it, do it with a stopwatch. Interview here, this place where I'm now, they did the presentation thing, screen went big, I couldn't see my clock anymore. I totally freaked out. And it doesn't matter, just do it. And I've basically done it so many times. I stuck to time because I prepared so often. I spent ages doing a tiny, short little presentation. You have to put the time in to do that and to get views from people. I think it's really valuable.
It's 100% agree with that. Hannah or Ben, do you want to close off the session?
I just have a very quick suggestion. Why don't we, since we have a LinkedIn group, why don't people who would like to help each other out with interviews just post it there and start a group there, and so that people can help each other out. Get 2 or 3 people on a call and just have everyone do their interviews, presentations, and get feedback from each other. That's what I would spend my time doing.
Talking about things, examples not to follow in terms of networking. Does this mean I need to join LinkedIn at some point?
You can also go on Twitter. Find Greg on Twitter.
Twitter's fine. That'll do.
But they can contact, whatever. I'm not going to leave you out there. But I'm just saying that that's a good way. So if you guys can, get 2 or 3 people together, spend an hour together, help each other out. Mostly it's about cheering each other on. Actually, it's not about criticism, because we are criticizing ourselves and we've gone through it a million times. So it's more about just cheering each other on, Toastmaster style. So Ben, if you want to close it up.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to close it out. So look, thanks so much to our panelists, Greg, Vicky, and Michael. That was a really fantastic discussion. I think there was a lot in there that was useful for people. You can tell by the reaction, all of the questions and things that were coming in, that I think people were really engaged. And thanks, of course, to Geoffrey for pulling it all together, reaching out to the panelists, chairing, I think, the session fantastically and facilitating a really interesting discussion. Just a couple of things to make people aware of. We do have a LinkedIn group, as Hannah said, so feel free to join us there. We also have a mailing list. You can go to our website at www.tprforum.org, sign up for our mailing list, and we can keep you up to date on future webinars. We do hold, roughly speaking, 1 a month, so we'll be back in October. And if you keep an eye both on social media and on our mailing list, we hope that we'll be able to see you there. So thanks very much to everyone who's come along today to listen and take part. We really appreciate having you here, and we look forward to welcoming you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.